Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun was unforgiving that afternoon, casting long, sharp shadows across the open market. The smell of sweat, dust, and overripe tomatoes hung thick in the air as Adora trudged through the crowd, pushing a rusted wheelbarrow filled with cassava flour she had just bought on credit. Her faded wrapper clung to her sweat-soaked skin, and her once glowing skin was now dulled by years of suffering. Behind her, her 7-year-old son Santo held a torn nylon bag, his oversized slippers slapping the ground with each step. They had just finished hawking bread around the motor park, only to return to this bustling market for their daily supply run. Her muscles ached, but her mind was heavier. Every day was a fight for survival. From dodging debt collectors to praying Santo didn't fall sick again. As she turned the corner, her breath caught. Standing arrogantly in front of a boutique, adorned in a red lace gown with golden heels, was Tonia, her ex-husband's mistress. And right beside her, leaning against a silver Corolla that he could barely fuel these days, was Ibuka, the man who once vowed never to let her suffer. Tonia's loud, mocking laughter split through the noise of the market as she pointed a manicured finger at Adora. So this is what you've reduced yourself to, Adora? From madam of the house to wheelbarrow pusher. Her voice was full of venom, meant to humiliate. Adora tried to walk past silently, but Ibuka added salt to the wound. I told you she was desperate to pin a child on me. See how she's dragging that boy around, a bastard without a name. The word bastard echoed like a gunshot. A few onlookers turned to stare. Some snickered. Others shook their heads in pity. Santo looked up at his mother, confused. "Mummy, what's a bastard?" he asked innocently, his voice trembling. Adora's heart shattered. She fought back tears, gripped the wheelbarrow tighter, and kept walking. But Tonia wasn't done. She walked closer, heels clicking confidently, and said loud enough for all to hear, "Maybe you should sell that child and use the money to wash your clothes." The market burst into laughter. Adora paused for a second, her body stiff with rage and pain, but she held her dignity. She kept walking, knowing any response would only entertain them more. But inside her soul screamed. She reached the street corner and dropped the wheelbarrow beside a kiosk. Her back leaned against the dusty wall as tears ran down her cheeks. Santo stood silently, unsure of what he had done wrong. Adora bent low, held his small face in her rough hands, and kissed his forehead. "You are not a bastard," she whispered. "You are my miracle." But her words were for herself as much as they were for him. She remembered the night she was thrown out, just a few weeks pregnant, bleeding, barefoot, and begging Ibuka to believe her. He slammed the door, saying he'd rather die than raise another man's child. She had almost lost the pregnancy to a miscarriage that night. But God preserved the child, and somehow she kept going. Since then, her life had been a cycle of pain, silence, and survival. But now, hearing him, the same man, call the boy a bastard in front of his mistress and strangers, that was a new kind of hell. And yet, even in that moment, something stirred deep inside her. Not anger, not revenge, something else. The fire of quiet resolve. She didn't know how, but they would regret ever mocking her son. It all started 2 years after their traditional wedding. Adora had always been the kind of woman who believed in love, sacrifice, and commitment. When Ibuka lost his job, she sold her jewelry, took up petty trading, and even gave up her tailoring dreams to support him. She stood by him through his darkest hours, only to be replaced when the light came. The day she discovered she was pregnant should have been a joyful one, but it turned into a nightmare. She had missed her period and taken a test, smiling with disbelief as the 2 lines confirmed her hopes. But when she told Ibuka, his reaction was like a cold slap. "Are you sure it's mine?" he asked, backing away from her like she was diseased. Her heart dropped. She thought he was joking, until Tonia appeared from the bedroom in his shirt. Tonia, the woman she had seen only once before, the woman he said was just a friend. That day, Adora was chased out of the house she had helped build with her sweat. Pregnant, homeless, alone. With nowhere to go, Adora wandered for hours until a kind woman selling akara offered her a place to sleep, a small wooden bench behind her roadside stall. For weeks, she lived there, waking at 4 a.m. to help fry akara in exchange for food and shelter. The pregnancy was difficult. She collapsed once from hunger and was rushed to a clinic by a stranger. The nurse told her she almost lost the baby due to stress and dehydration. Adora cried herself to sleep that night, wondering how her life had turned into this. But she refused to abort the child. "Even if the whole world turns against me, I will live for you," she told the tiny bump. Over time, she moved to a Face Me I Face You compound where the walls smelled of kerosene and dreams. She washed clothes, hawked moi, and sold sachet water, building her life back piece by piece. And through it all, she never once saw Ibuka again, not even during her son's naming. It was as if she had been erased from existence. But she knew one day, she'd be remembered. What she didn't know was that the mistress who replaced her was living a double life. Tonia had money, but it came from shady deals and sugar daddies. She gave Ibuka a taste of luxury, enough to blind him to the truth. They traveled, posted pictures online, and mocked Adora in group chats. But beneath the glamour was a fragile foundation. Tonia controlled everything, from Ibuka's ATM card to what he wore to church. And when he tried to resist, she reminded him of what he left behind. "You want to go back to that gutter girl and her bastard? Be my guest," she'd say. Ibuka swallowed his pride every time. And even though he laughed at Adora in public, deep down, guilt had begun to gnaw at his soul. Guilt he buried under alcohol, loud music, and sex. But what neither of them knew was that the very child they laughed at, the boy with his father's eyes, would one day become the source of their biggest regret. Years before Adora met Chinidu, he had once been hopelessly in love with Tonia. Back when he sold electronics on the roadside and slept in a tiny one-room apartment with peeling walls, Chinidu had dared to dream of building a life with her. He was hardworking, honest, and loyal, but broke. And to Tonia, being broke was the only sin that couldn't be forgiven. She would flirt with him during the day, borrow money from him, and then vanish on weekend nights to be with other men who had cars and perfume that cost more than Chinidu's rent. When he finally gathered the courage to propose, offering her a simple ring he saved up for months to buy, she laughed in his face. "Me? Marry you? A man who can't even afford his own generator? No be jazz you want use." That humiliation stayed with Chinidu for years. He cried that night and swore to never beg for love again. He left Lagos for Abuja, determined to change his story. And he did, through sweat, pain, and betrayal. He became one of Nigeria's youngest self-made millionaires in the agricultural export business. But money doesn't always heal wounds. Even with all his wealth, multiple properties, and fancy cars, Chinidu never forgot the sting of that rejection. He built walls around his heart, never letting any woman in again. That is, until he saw Adora. He was driving through the market in his tinted SUV, scouting locations for a new warehouse, when he noticed a woman pushing a heavy wheelbarrow with a little boy by her side. Something about her posture, her pain, and the quiet strength in her eyes struck him. He slowed down, then stopped altogether when he recognized her face. It wasn't immediate, but it came, a memory from years ago when he had passed by her shop while she was measuring fabric for a customer. Back then, she had smiled easily. Now, she looked like life had chewed her and spat her out. He watched in shock as Tonia, the same Tonia who had once mocked his poverty, stood just meters away, laughing at this woman. That was when the truth hit him. This woman, Adora, was everything Tonia was not: strong, loyal, resilient. And he felt something stir again, something he thought he had buried long ago. He didn't approach her that day. Instead, he followed from a distance, watching her struggle to cross the road while holding the boy's hand. He watched her bargain over Gary, only to walk away because she didn't have enough money. He sat in his car, feeling something between guilt and admiration. He instructed his driver to tail her until she got home. When he saw where she lived, his heart sank. A building barely standing, walls blackened with smoke, doors hanging off weak hinges. And yet, from the dimly lit window of her room, he saw her laugh with her son, brushing his hair and feeding him soaked Gary with groundnut. That night, Chinidu couldn't sleep. The woman he once saw as just another face in the market had now become the one thing he couldn't stop thinking about. And for the first time in years, Chinidu, the billionaire who had everything, wanted something money couldn't buy, a chance to rewrite a story with her. That night, as the rain pounded the zinc roof like the beat of war drums, Adora lay awake beside Santo in their one-room apartment. The room was dimly lit by the flickering glow of a rechargeable lamp, its battery nearly dead. Santo slept with his head on her arm, breathing softly, unaware of the weight his mother carried on her chest. Adora stared at the cracked ceiling, counting the days she had gone without a full meal, not for lack of appetite, but because her son's belly came first. Her body ached from the labor of the day. She had cleaned 5 houses, sold pap at dawn, and rushed to the market before sundown. Her palms were blistered, her back stiff, but it was her heart that was truly broken. The words "bastard" and "useless woman" still rang in her head, echoing louder than the thunder outside. Adora bit her lips until they bled, trying not to sob. She didn't want to wake Santo, her only source of strength. Each day was survival, and each night she reminded herself she had to live for him, even if her soul was slowly dying in silence. She had no time for dreams or luxury. Every kobo she made went into rent, feeding, and Santo's school fees. The boy was brilliant, always first in his class, and it pained her that she couldn't afford to buy him a new pair of school shoes. He wore torn sandals, the soles stitched with thread and sealed with tape. Other parents mocked him, some teachers pitied him. But Adora held her head high whenever she dropped him off. Dignity was the only wealth she had left. And though her heart bled when he asked questions like, "Mummy, why don't I have a daddy?" she never showed him her tears. Instead, she told him stories, stories of warriors and kings, of how strength didn't come from riches, but from resilience. What she didn't tell him was that the man who had made her pregnant was still alive, and still blind to the truth. She had convinced herself that telling Santo about Ibuka was unnecessary. What would she gain? More confusion? More pain? The boy was better off not knowing the man who had called him a mistake. So she buried the truth deep beneath her bones, where even grief couldn't reach. But the truth has a way of crawling through cracks. Days later, she found an old envelope while rearranging the cupboard. It was dusty and sealed, a letter she had written to Ibuka after he threw her out. She had given it to a friend to deliver, but never followed up. Curiosity took over. She sat on the wooden floor, opened it, and read the trembling words of her younger self. The letter detailed everything: the pregnancy, the night she bled but refused to give up, and her plea for a second chance. At the end, she had written, "Whether you believe it or not, this child is yours. I just want him to grow knowing peace." As Adora read her own words, tears flowed freely. She had tried. She had given him the chance to be a father. But now, it was too late. She looked over at Santo, now older, wiser, and full of questions. She didn't know if the truth would one day find him. But tonight, she made peace with her choice. She would keep protecting him, even from the man who gave him life. From the outside, Chinida's life looked like a dream. He had it all: cars with automatic doors, a duplex in Lekki Phase 1, staff who bowed when he walked past, and bank alerts that lit up his phone every day. But beneath that polished surface was a man still haunted by rejection. No matter how much money he made, how many accolades he received, or how many women threw themselves at him, he still remembered the girl in high heels who once looked at him like he was nothing. Tonia. Her laughter, her cruelty, her cold dismissal, they had become the fuel for his ambition. Every night, he replayed that day in his mind. How he knelt in the mud, holding out a ring, and how she laughed as her new boyfriend pulled up in a Benz, spraying Naira notes. "You better marry poverty," she said, slamming the door in his face. That wound never healed. Even as he stood on balconies overlooking the city, Chinidu felt like a man trapped in the past. His mansion was filled with echoes, not voices. His fridge had food, but no one to ask, "How was your day?" Seeing Adora that day changed something. There was no pity in how he looked at her, only awe. Her suffering was visible, but her strength was louder. She reminded him of himself, once mocked, once broken. She had no makeup, no designer clothes, yet her eyes had a fire that could melt steel. He made a quiet vow that night to help her rise. Not for romance, not for revenge, but because someone needed to. And maybe, just maybe, by lifting her, he could find healing too. He began with small steps. He instructed his company driver to tail her discreetly and learn her routine. He found out where she bought food, how she took loans from petty traders, and which landlords were harassing her. Without revealing his identity, he paid off her debts, sent anonymous gifts, and even covered Santo's next school term through a foundation. Adora never knew where the help was coming from. She thought it was grace. But it was a man finally using his wealth for more than status. Then came the unexpected, a business proposal. Chinidu had plans to open a cassava processing mini-factory on the mainland, and he offered Adora a chance to be involved. She declined at first, wary of strangers bearing favors. But something in his voice calmed her. She agreed to a meeting, just one. When she entered his office days later and realized it was the same man who had once pushed a wheelbarrow beside her years ago, she was stunned. He smiled gently and said, "I didn't come to rescue you. I came to walk beside you." It was the first time in years she had heard something that didn't make her feel small. They talked for hours, not about love or loss, but about pain and healing. Chinidu didn't offer her luxury. He offered partnership. And Adora, though still cautious, felt something shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, someone saw her, not as a victim or a burden, but as a woman with fire left in her bones. Tonia had always been the type of woman who knew how to dress her lies in perfume and glitter. From the moment she snatched Ibuka from Adora, she had controlled his life like a remote. She chose his clothes, dictated his movements, and even monitored his phone calls. What Ibuka saw as love was really manipulation wrapped in seduction. Tonia used the power of her wealthy lovers to fund her lavish lifestyle. She wasn't a businesswoman. She was a parasite who sucked success from anyone foolish enough to trust her. But lately, things had started falling apart. One of her biggest sponsors had been arrested abroad for fraud. Her access to credit cards and coded bank accounts had dried up. And now, with Ibuka jobless and her accounts frozen, reality was setting in. She blamed Adora for everything, claiming the woman was casting spiritual curses from the trenches. "If not for that witch, I would have been married to a senator by now," she would hiss, clutching her iPhone like a dagger. Ibuka, drunk half the time, couldn't care less. His eyes were hollow. His pride was dead. One morning, while checking her mail, Tonia received a notice, a court summons. The fraud investigation had reached her name. Apparently, one of the companies she had fronted for had listed her as a primary signatory. She panicked, pacing her room, calling everyone she once slept with for help. No one answered. They had moved on to newer, shinier options. Her desperation grew. In a last-ditch effort, she reached out to Chinidu, not knowing he was the silent hand behind Adora's rise. She sent a long message, pretending to apologize for their past. "I was young and foolish," she wrote. "I miss our conversations." Chinidu read the message in silence. Then he typed one word, "seen." And that was it. No response. No pity. Just silence, the kind that screamed louder than any insult. Tonia threw the phone across the room. For the first time, she realized what true rejection felt like. Meanwhile, Ibuka stumbled into their apartment with blood on his shirt and a bruised lip. He had been beaten up by area boys after trying to pawn his phone at midnight for quick cash. Tonia didn't even flinch. "You're useless," she spat, throwing a sachet of pure water at him. "You left a woman who would have stood by you for this." He stared at her, then at his reflection in the cracked mirror. For the first time, he saw what he had become, a man who lost everything chasing a shadow. He sat down slowly, head in his hands, remembering the day he had driven Adora out. She was crying, bleeding, pregnant. And he didn't even ask if she had a place to go. The realization crushed him. But the worst part was yet to come. because soon he would learn the truth, that the bastard boy he mocked was his own flesh and blood. And by the time he tried to fix it, it would already be too late. The sun was just beginning to rise when Adora wrapped a scarf around her hair and tied Santo's shoelaces. His school bag was old and had one strap hanging by a safety pin, but it still carried his books and his hopes. She adjusted the neckline of his shirt, kissed his forehead, and walked him halfway to school before returning to her small pop-up stall near the market. There, she sold cooked beans and soaked Gary to Okada riders and laborers. She had no idea that someone watched her every morning from a tinted SUV parked across the street. Chinita didn't know why he couldn't stop. Something about the way she moved, never complaining, never begging, intrigued him. This wasn't just admiration. It was respect born from witnessing someone wrestle life without bitterness. That morning, however, he made a decision. No more hiding. He stepped out of his car for the first time since following her and approached her stall quietly. Adora looked up, her brows knitting in confusion as she recognized him, the rich man from the office she visited. "Good morning," he said softly, holding a cooler. "I brought some foodstuff. You mentioned you ran out last time." Adora was caught off guard. She wasn't used to kindness without strings. Her instinct was to reject it, but something about the sincerity in his eyes softened her. She nodded slowly, motioning to a bench near her. He sat, unbothered by the dusty wood or the noisy market women nearby. They talked for over an hour, not about business, but about life. She shared how she used to dream of owning a fashion school, how her son wanted to become an engineer, and how she feared he'd drop out if things didn't improve. Chinita listened, genuinely moved. When she asked why he was helping her, he didn't give a rehearsed answer. "Because I know what it's like to be mocked for where you are," he said. "And I know what it feels like to rise when no one believes you can." She looked at him, eyes glistening. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a poor woman, not as a single mother, but as a human being. The feeling terrified her. From that day on, Chinita became a quiet but steady presence in her life. He didn't flood her with riches or promises. Instead, he showed up when it mattered. When her landlord threatened to evict her, she mysteriously got a call that the rent had been covered by an anonymous donor. When Santo fell ill, he was admitted to a private clinic where all bills had already been settled. She tried asking questions, tried pushing him away, but Chinita always smiled and said, "Let me do this for the boy. He reminds me of who I used to be." Little did they both know that the connection went deeper than empathy. Santo wasn't just a reflection of Chinita's past. He was the living consequence of a past Adora and her ex-husband tried to bury. A truth was crawling to the surface, one that would change all their lives forever. Tonia sat on the edge of her unkempt bed, chain-smoking, her eyes red with exhaustion and rage. She had not slept properly in days. The court summons had shaken her. The fear of prison loomed like a shadow over her fake lashes and foundation-covered lies. Her businesses had crumbled, her lovers had abandoned her, and now she was stuck with a broke man and a failing image. Worst of all, Chinita, the one she used to mock and belittle, now ignored her as though she was beneath notice. It was eating her alive. She watched videos online of him attending conferences, donating to orphanages, and launching new factories. The last straw came when she saw a viral photo of Chinita sitting with Adora at a public business forum, both of them smiling. Rage shot through her chest like acid. "So he left me and is now feeding that rat," she growled. In her twisted mind, Adora had always been beneath her, a weakling who didn't know how to keep a man. Tonia poured herself a drink and began to scheme. She decided to confront Adora directly. With Ibuka reluctantly following behind, she stormed into Adora's stall one afternoon, causing a scene. "So this is what you've become? Collecting men like hand-me-down clothes?" Tonia shouted, drawing attention from passers-by. Adora remained calm, wiping her hands on a napkin before facing her. "You came to my life, took what I had, and spat on me. Now that I'm rebuilding, you think you can shake me?" she said, her voice calm but cutting. Ibuka stood there awkwardly, unable to meet Adora's eyes. Santo, who was nearby, came running. When Tonia turned to insult the boy again, Adora stepped forward and slapped her so hard her earrings flew off. The crowd gasped. Tonia lunged, but Ibuka pulled her back. "Don't you ever call my son a bastard again," Adora said, trembling with anger. Tonia spat on the floor and swore to destroy her. "You'll regret this. Both of you," she hissed before storming off. What she didn't realize was that she had just declared war, not against a helpless woman, but against a mother with nothing left to lose. After the confrontation, Ibuka began spiraling deeper into guilt. He couldn't sleep. Santo's face haunted him. The boy looked so much like his younger brother. His features, his walk, even his smile. Questions began crawling through his mind. Was it possible? Could the boy be his? The memory of Adora bleeding and pleading that night he threw her out replayed like a broken record. That night, Ibuka got drunk and stumbled into their room, crying. "I think I made a mistake," he whispered. Tonia looked at him with disgust. "You've always been a mistake," she replied, slamming the door. Meanwhile, Chinidu, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, was preparing for something that would change everything. A public event where Adora and Santo would be at the center stage, unknowingly walking into a moment that would reveal the past and explode the future. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, as the wind rustled through torn curtains and the scent of rain lingered in the air, Adora sat alone by the window holding a letter. It was old and yellowed, the ink slightly smudged by time, but the pain in its words still felt fresh. It was the same letter she once gave her friend to deliver to Ibuka, the letter that held her last shred of hope before her world collapsed. She had stumbled upon it earlier while sorting through old boxes in the wardrobe. Apparently, it was never delivered. The envelope had never been opened. With trembling hands, she opened it and read her own handwriting, words written with the desperation of a heart not yet broken. It detailed everything: how she discovered the pregnancy, how she prayed night after night that Ibuka would believe her, how she wept when she bled but still held on to faith, and how she forgave him even before he asked. Reading it now, Adora couldn't believe how much of herself she had poured into one man's unwilling hands. "If only you had opened this," she muttered. "Maybe everything would have been different." At the same time, in a neighborhood not too far away, Ibuka sat on the edge of his bed, staring at an envelope of his own. He had stolen Santo's toothbrush during one of the confrontations and taken it to a private lab for DNA testing. Now, the results were in his hands. He had torn the envelope open like a madman, desperate to prove to himself that Adora had indeed betrayed him. But what he saw made his knees buckle. 99.9% probability of paternity. The words glared back at him like a death sentence. Santo was his son, the same boy he mocked, humiliated, and rejected publicly. The same child he allowed his mistress to insult. His body went numb. His past, his ego, his arrogance, it all came crashing down. How had he become this? A man who threw away his own flesh and blood for the approval of a woman who only ever wanted his name, not his heart. Ibuka wept like a child, burying his face in his palms. For the first time in his adult life, he saw himself clearly, and he hated what he saw. But the damage was done. Adora didn't need him anymore. She had built something for herself, something that didn't involve him. And Chinidu, the man he once mocked as a beggar, was now part of her world. Ibuka was too late. Still, he made up his mind to try. He would show up, explain everything, and hope for mercy, even if he didn't deserve it. Meanwhile, Adora sat in her room, thinking about the unopened letter. She burned it that night, along with every photo she had of Ibuka. She didn't need closure from a man who never valued her. All she needed now was peace, and that was something Chinidu, without asking, was already giving her. But fate wasn't done yet. The truth had been revealed. Yes, but the consequences were only just beginning. The school compound buzzed with activity as children played and mothers waited near the gate. Adora clutched a bag of snacks for Santo's break time. She rarely visited the school during the day, but today was different. She had been summoned. Santo had gotten into a fight with a classmate who called him a market child and claimed his father was unknown. The moment Adora heard, her heart cracked not because of the fight, but because her son was being punished for a truth he didn't even know. She arrived quietly, greeted the teachers respectfully, and asked to see her son. The headmistress's expression was tight, judging. "Madam, your son is beginning to cause trouble. Maybe you should teach him how to behave," she said coldly. Adora's mouth opened slightly in disbelief. "So you didn't think to ask what the other child said to provoke him?" she asked. The woman adjusted her glasses. "Well, your background doesn't exactly inspire discipline." That was the final straw. The subtle insults she had endured for years boiled over. "This school takes my money just like it takes every other parent's. My son deserves respect," she snapped. As the tension thickened, a mocking voice rang from behind. "Oh, look who's pretending to be a mother now." It was Tonia. She had been invited to speak at the PTA meeting and was coincidentally on the school board due to her connections. She walked in, hips swaying, expensive perfume trailing behind her like arrogance. Adora turned sharply. "I won't let you insult me here," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Tonia laughed. "Your son is a bastard, Adora, and no amount of shouting can change that." The words hit like a slap, but before Adora could respond, Samto stepped out of a corridor, eyes wide with confusion and pain. He had heard it. Every word. Adora's body trembled. She looked at her son, then turned back to Tonia and, without warning, delivered a thunderous slap that sent the woman staggering. Gasps echoed around the compound. The headmistress screamed for order, teachers rushed in, and Tonia stood with a hand to her cheek, stunned. "I warned you," Adora whispered, standing protectively in front of her son. "Never insult my child again." That single act turned everything upside down. The school filed a complaint. Adora was arrested for assault. Samto cried the entire time as 2 police officers dragged his mother into their van. It wasn't the slap that got her in trouble. It was who she slapped. Tonia pulled strings quickly, using her network to ensure Adora spent the night in custody. Inside the dingy cell, Adora leaned against the damp wall, biting her lips to suppress the scream building in her throat. Her clothes were soaked from rain, her feet were bare, and her body ached. But her heart ached more for her son. She had protected him the only way she knew how, but at what cost? As she sat there in the dark, the sound of the door creaking open startled her. A calm voice said, "Her bail has been paid." She looked up. It was Chinidu. He didn't say much, just helped her up and wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. "Let's go home," he whispered. In that moment, she didn't know whether to cry from shame or relief. But she followed him, silently vowing to never let Tonia win again. The drive from the station was silent at first. Adora sat beside Chinidu, staring out the window as Lagos sped past in a blur of traffic, neon lights, and late-night hustle. She held herself tightly, her body cold and trembling, though the car's air conditioning was off. Chinidu didn't ask questions. He didn't offer false comfort either. He simply drove, calm and steady, like a man who knew exactly how broken silence could be. When they arrived at her compound, she opened the car door without a word. He reached into the back seat and handed her a small envelope. "There's a lawyer's card inside," he said. "If they try anything again, call him. He's already been briefed." Adora's hands trembled as she accepted it. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. Chinidu met her eyes. "Because you're the strongest person I've ever met. And because I know what it means to be dragged through the mud while people laugh." His voice didn't waver, but something in his tone carried years of pain. She nodded slowly, then walked away. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the stars. Maybe for the first time in years, she felt safe. The next few days brought small miracles. Samto's school fees were paid. His uniforms were replaced. A new backpack arrived at their door. No name, no note. Just a quiet blessing. Adora tried to trace the source, but knew exactly who it was. She visited Chinida's office one afternoon, intending to confront him, but ended up staying for hours. They talked about life, regret, and pain. Chinidu told her about Tonia, about how she once rejected him and how he had vowed never to look back. She laughed at me for being broke, he said. Now she's choking on the same pride. Adora, surprised by the confession, felt a strange sense of poetic justice. They shared a moment of silence. Two people who had been broken by the same woman, now trying to rebuild their lives on the ashes she left behind. That day, Chinidu asked her to take up a management role in one of his supply chains. I trust you, he said. Not because I pity you, but because I've seen what you can survive. Adora hesitated, then agreed. Not for charity, but for her future. As weeks passed, a new chapter slowly began to unfold. Adora managed the position well, balancing work and motherhood with grace. She was still cautious, still wounded, but something about Chinida's presence gave her room to breathe. He never pushed her. He never reminded her of the favors. He simply stood beside her, supportive, steady, and silent when needed. Santo began to flourish too. His teachers noticed he smiled more, participated in class, and had become protective of his mother. But behind every smile still lingered a question: the identity of his father. Adora hadn't told him. Not yet. And the longer she waited, the harder it became. What she didn't know was that the truth was already catching up, faster than she could run. Ibuka had made a decision, one that would put them all on a collision course none of them were prepared for. The hall was filled with rows of white chairs, colorful balloons, and the chatter of parents and students. It was the school's interstate academic award ceremony, and students from various districts had come to represent their schools in mathematics, science, and essay writing. Santo had been selected by his teacher for the Science Challenge, a competition where each participant was expected to explain a natural phenomenon live on stage. Adora had almost said no. She didn't want more public mockery or reminders of her status. But Santo had pleaded, and Chinidu had gently encouraged her to let him go. So there they were, seated among a crowd of neatly dressed families, with Adora wearing a second-hand lace gown and Santo in a borrowed suit. She clapped nervously as names were called. Then it was his turn. Representing Future Scholars Academy, Santo Adora. The crowd clapped, some less enthusiastically than others. As he climbed the stage, whispers followed. That's the market boy. Is that his mother? Where's his father? Adora heard it all. But she sat still, face straight, heart pounding. Santo's presentation was brilliant. He used simple materials to explain how a volcano works, drawing loud applause from the judges. The confidence in his voice, the brightness in his eyes. Adora couldn't believe her son was becoming this bold. He finished and bowed. The hall rose in applause. Adora felt pride swell in her chest, tears threatening to fall. But before the moment could settle, a shrill voice echoed across the room. Anyone can talk science. Let's talk about his origin. Where is his father? It was Tonia. She stood up with Ibuka beside her, arms crossed, lips curved in a smirk. Adora froze. Her hands clenched. The audience went silent. Santo's smile faded as he looked at the couple. Ibuka's eyes met Adora's. Something in him looked broken, but he said nothing. Tonia stepped forward, microphone in hand. Let's not pretend. We all know the boy's a bastard, she said. Gasps erupted. Children turned. Teachers began to intervene. But before chaos could spread, the sound of a horn cut through the noise, deep, commanding, and loud. All heads turned. A sleek black limousine pulled up just outside the transparent doors of the auditorium. The doors opened slowly, and out stepped Chinidu, dressed in a dark suit, sunglasses perched on his nose. He walked with the calm authority of someone who had been through fire and come out shining. Silence fell. Adora stood in shock, not knowing he would come. Santo's eyes lit up. Chinidu walked straight to the boy, removed his glasses, and knelt. I'm proud of you, he said. And no matter what anyone says, you are not alone. Then he turned to the crowd and said clearly, he is my son. The hall erupted in stunned murmurs. Cameras clicked. Faces changed. Tonia's mouth fell open. Ibuka looked as if someone had punched the breath from his lungs. Chinidu walked Santo back to his seat, holding his hand. Adora stood frozen, 1,000 emotions tearing through her at once. But one thing was clear. The tide had turned. and nothing would ever be the same again. The ripple from Chinita's public declaration didn't stop at the ceremony. It swept across every social circle connected to the school and beyond. Videos of him kneeling beside Samto, claiming the boy as his son, flooded social media. Most people didn't even know his name at first. They simply referred to him as the man in the limousine. For many, it was a moment of unexpected drama. But for Ibuka and Tonia, it was something else entirely. Tonia's world shattered in that instant. The man she once mocked for being broke had not only returned with wealth and dignity, he had publicly claimed the child she had spent years calling a bastard. She didn't care whether or not he was the biological father. What stung was the imagery. Adora standing tall beside a man of power and substance, while she stood beside Ibuka, now a disgraced, broke shadow of himself. Tonia tried to save face, but her eyes were wild, her composure crumbling. Ibuka, on the other hand, couldn't move. He sat frozen as the truth burned through his chest. He had always mocked that child, thrown words like knives, and now someone else had picked up what he threw away and polished it into gold. Backstage, while parents congratulated Adora and Samto, Ibuka managed to pull himself together enough to follow them. He didn't confront Chinidu. Instead, he approached Adora directly for the first time in years. His eyes were glassy, his voice hoarse. "Adora, I need to talk to you. Alone." She turned slowly, still clutching Samto's hand. "About what?" she asked sharply. "About the boy, about the fact that he's mine." Her heart dropped. She hadn't expected that confrontation so soon. "You think you deserve a conversation?" she whispered, stepping closer, her voice low with rage. "You had 7 years to be a father. 7 years to ask questions. 7 years to remember that night. But you chose to call him names. You stood beside a woman who humiliated your own blood. You let them call my son a bastard in public." Ibuka lowered his head in shame. "I was blind," he muttered. "I was manipulated. I didn't know he was mine." Adora scoffed. "You didn't care to know." Her voice cracked, but she held her tears. "You came too late, Ibuka. And even if you beg on your knees, you'll never be Samto's father in his heart. That place is taken." Chinidu joined her at that moment, placing a protective hand on her back. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Adora shook her head. "Not anymore." Ibuka nodded, defeated. "Can I at least see him sometimes?" he asked, his voice now desperate. Adora looked him dead in the eyes. "When you called him a bastard, you lost that right." She walked away without another word, Samto looking up at her with silent understanding. Chinidu placed a hand on Ibuka's shoulder briefly, not with malice, but pity. "You threw away something priceless," he said quietly. "And sometimes we don't get second chances." Ibuka didn't follow them. He stood there in the empty corridor of the school, surrounded by whispers and echoes of his past. For the first time in his life, he truly felt what it meant to be alone, not just without people, but without worth. The aftermath of the school event hit Tonia like a hurricane. Her name became poison in social circles. The Parents' Association expelled her from the school board. Her clients began pulling out of business deals, not wanting to associate with the woman who publicly insulted a child. Screenshots of her calling Samto a bastard were shared like wildfire. She tried to post clarifications online, claiming she had been misunderstood, but no one believed her. Even the few sponsors she had left vanished. The fraud charges she had hoped to bury were suddenly reopened. Her lawyer stopped taking her calls, and one morning, she woke up to see her car being repossessed outside. Ibuka was still in shock himself. He had spent days locked in the house, drinking away the truth and avoiding mirrors. He couldn't look at his own reflection without seeing a monster. His friends stopped checking in. He had become a cautionary tale. The man who abandoned his own son, only to watch another man give the boy the love and future he never could. Tonia's bitterness grew into resentment. She began blaming everyone for her downfall. Adora, Chinidu, Samto, even Ibuka. "You should have controlled her," she spat one night, slamming a pot on the table. "You let her humiliate me." Ibuka didn't respond. He had nothing left. The apartment they stayed in was now half furnished, most of the expensive items sold off. No generator, no fuel, no DSTV. Just heat, silence, and roaches. One night, Ibuka found a photo of Samto online, standing beside Chinidu at a science camp. The boy was smiling, his eyes glowing with joy. Ibuka stared at the screen for hours. "That should have been me," he whispered. But the truth was harsh. He had traded a diamond for dust. Adora, on the other hand, was still cautious. Though Chinidu had never made any romantic advances, she could feel the shift. The way he looked at her, spoke to her. It was more than kindness. But she wasn't ready. Her wounds were still too fresh. For now, she focused on her son and her work, rising slowly with quiet strength. Then came the day when everything changed again. A reporter showed up at Chinida's gate, seeking an interview about the mysterious single mother and the billionaire who claimed her child. He declined, but the article went viral anyway. Adora's story, her struggles, her resilience, became public knowledge. But instead of mockery, people began praising her. "She's a real queen," someone wrote. "A woman who survived hell and raised a star." Ibuka read the article from his phone in a bar, his eyes red with regret. Tonia, meanwhile, threw her phone at the wall. "She's nothing," she screamed. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had lost. Adora hadn't just survived. She had won. And now, even without lifting a finger, Adora's revenge was unfolding. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. Adora stood by the window of her newly rented two-bedroom apartment, watching Samto solve math problems at the dining table. The boy had blossomed in ways she never imagined. His laughter came easily now, his eyes no longer clouded by sadness. Chinidu visited often, sometimes bringing books, sometimes just coming to share a quiet meal. He never forced his presence, he earned it. Adora was grateful, not just for the material support, but for the dignity he gave her, the way he looked at her with respect, not pity. Life still had challenges, yes. But for the first time in years, she wasn't merely surviving. She was healing. And yet, part of her remained on edge. Trauma didn't disappear overnight. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she still heard Tonia's laughter and Ibuka's voice calling her child a name that cut deeper than any blade. Ibuka, on the other hand, had become a ghost of himself. He tried reaching out again, through letters, through mutual contacts, but Adora never responded. She had said all that needed to be said. He began attending church, seeking forgiveness from strangers, because he knew he couldn't get it from her. His mother, who once supported Tonia, now refused to speak to him. "You disgraced this family," she had said. "Your father would be ashamed." He spent most nights alone, staring at the ceiling, wishing he could rewind time. But life didn't offer do-overs. Meanwhile, Tonia's life unraveled completely. She was arrested one morning in her towel after new evidence linked her to a money laundering ring. Cameras captured the moment, and within hours, the video went viral. She begged for help, called names, but no one came. Not even Ibuka. When he heard of her arrest, he simply turned off his phone and poured another drink. He had nothing left to lose, and nothing left to save. As all this unfolded, Adora received a call from Samto's school. The principal wanted to see her. She arrived nervously, only to find Chinidu already seated. The principal smiled and said, "Your son was selected to represent the school internationally." Adora's eyes widened. She turned to Samto, who beamed with pride. "They want to sponsor me to Dubai," he said. Tears filled her eyes. This boy, this child they mocked, was now flying to places they only dreamed of. Chinidu reached for her hand. "I told you he was destined for greatness," he whispered. She nodded, speechless. The tables had turned, not with loud vengeance or curses, but with grace, growth, and undeniable victory. And deep inside her, a voice whispered, "We made it." Tonia's arrest didn't stay buried in whispers. It exploded into headlines. Online tabloids and national newspapers released a full exposé on her fraudulent business empire, highlighting her laundering schemes, fake companies, and the names of the victims she scammed. One of the reports even featured her initial rejection of Chinita back when he was broke. A video surfaced, recorded years ago at a club, showing her laughing at him for trying to propose with a simple ring. The irony wasn't lost on the public. The man she rejected now lives in a mansion, one user tweeted. And the woman she mocked is now his queen. That one tweet was shared thousands of times. In prison, Tonia was no longer the queen bee. She was just another inmate with a soiled name. Her makeup couldn't save her, nor could her charm. She cried herself to sleep each night, haunted by images of Chinidu holding Adora's hand, and Samto smiling like he belonged. She cursed everything, God, fate, Adora. But deep down, she knew it was her own greed and pride that had built her prison walls. Meanwhile, Chinidu continued living a quiet life of power. His name was now associated with honor, class, and resilience. People admired him for supporting Adora and standing up for a child the world once ridiculed. He remained grounded, staying away from interviews and avoiding cameras. But behind the scenes, he made moves. He launched scholarships in Samto's name, donated secretly to struggling single mothers, and mentored small-scale farmers across rural states. He did it all without noise. But there was one thing he still hadn't done: confess his feelings to Adora. Not because he feared rejection, but because he respected her healing. Adora had grown, not just in financial standing, but in confidence. She now carried herself with calm elegance. She spoke less, but her silence held power. She had become a woman whose pain no longer controlled her, only shaped her wisdom. Every time Chinidu looked at her, he saw not a victim, but a survivor who had earned her throne the hard way. Ibuka, on the other hand, lived in shameful obscurity. He now worked as a POS operator for a street kiosk. Every day, he sat beside a dusty kiosk handling transfers for customers who once called him chairman. His body grew thinner, his eyes sunken with regret. Sometimes people recognized him. "You be that guy way abandon your son, ABI," they'd say. He didn't respond anymore. He just nodded and hoped they would walk away quickly. One evening, a child approached him holding a school bag. It wasn't Samto, but the resemblance made his heart stop. "Uncle, a beg, fit borrow me chair, sit down small," the boy asked. Ibuka nodded slowly. As the boy sat beside him doing homework, Ibuka stared at him quietly. "If I had just read that letter, if I had listened," he murmured to himself. He was now a ghost, haunting a life he once owned. A man with a heart full of apologies, and no one left to hear them. Ibuka tried one final time. It was on a Sunday afternoon. He stood outside Adora's compound holding a worn-out bag of clothes and a letter of apology he had written at midnight. His hand trembled as he knocked on the gate, uncertain if anyone would even open. When the maid answered, he requested to see her madam. The girl frowned and said, "Olga, she no day see people like that." But before she could shut the gate, Adora's voice rang from behind, calm but firm. "Let him in." Ibuka entered slowly, hat in hand. He looked around at the clean compound, the flowers, the calm. This wasn't the woman he once threw out barefoot. This was a woman transformed by pain and purpose. Adora didn't offer a seat. She stood still, arms crossed, waiting. "I came to say I'm sorry," he began, voice shaking. "I know words mean little now, but I can't keep living with this guilt." He handed her the letter. She didn't take it. "What do you want from me, Ibuka?" she asked, tone icy. "Forgiveness." He nodded slowly. "Just that. And maybe to know the boy." Her lips pressed together. She took a deep breath. "You're not the one who raised him. You lost that right a long time ago." Ibuka's eyes welled with tears. "I know. But maybe, just maybe, I could be a friend to him. Help when I can. Show him I've changed." Adora's face didn't soften. "The last time you saw him, you called him a bastard in front of strangers. You let another woman spit on my name and said nothing. You left me to starve when I was pregnant with your child. You don't get to erase that just because you finally feel guilty." Her words were like knives, but they were deserved. Ibuka bowed his head, tears dropping onto the cement floor. "I've lost everything, Adora. Tonia is in prison. I live in a room smaller than your store. I deserve nothing. I just want you to know. I regret it all." For a moment, silence fell. Then Adora stepped forward, standing just inches away. I hope you find peace, Ibuka. I really do. But don't ever come near my son again. He's happy. He's loved. And he doesn't need to see the man who once denied his existence. She turned and walked away. This time, Ibuka didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, alone with his broken heart. Chinita watched from the upstairs balcony, having seen the entire exchange. He didn't interfere. Adora didn't need protection anymore. She had become her own defender. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching Santo sketch robots in his notebook, Chinita finally spoke. You did the right thing, he said gently. Adora sighed. He waited too long. People think they can return after destruction, expecting mercy like a meal waiting on the table. Chinita nodded. But your strength isn't in rejecting him. It's in surviving him. She looked at him, eyes soft for once. And thank you for never asking for anything in return. Chinita smiled. Some things are worth waiting for. The air between them grew still, heavy with emotion. Nothing else needed to be said. They just sat quietly, beside a child once called a mistake, now the brightest part of both their lives. Santo stood at the airport, his passport in one hand and a boarding pass in the other. He wore a fitted suit, freshly gifted by Chinita, and a pair of sneakers Adora saved 6 months to buy. As the group of selected students prepared for their flight to Dubai, cameras flashed and journalists interviewed the lucky winners. Santo was calm, his confidence natural. But he kept glancing back at his mother and Chinita, both waving from the departure gate, tears in their eyes. Adora smiled through her emotions. Just a few years ago, she was feeding this boy soaked Gary and praying he wouldn't fall sick. Today, he was heading abroad as a symbol of excellence. The pain, the shame, the mockery, it had all led to this. She felt her knees weaken from joy, and Chinita held her steady. He's going to make us proud, he said. He already has, she replied, her voice cracking. This wasn't just a trip. It was a statement. The boy they had called a bastard was now flying first class. And the world had no choice but to watch him rise. Back at home, Ibuka sat outside his room on a wooden bench, listening to the radio. The news mentioned the students heading to Dubai. Santo's name was called, and the broadcaster praised his brilliance. Ibuka closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. He had never felt pain like this. Regret wasn't just an emotion now, it was his prison. He had no one to blame but himself. He imagined being at the airport, waving proudly, taking pictures beside his son. But he had traded that for ego and lies. Even his mother, once so critical of Adora, now refused to let him near the family house. You spat on our legacy, she told him. You threw away your blood. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He just sat quietly, listening to his son's name echo on the radio, like a ghost chasing the echoes of a life he could have had. He wanted to scream. He wanted to be angry. But the only person left to hate was himself. As the plane took off and the wheels lifted from the runway, Adora whispered a prayer. Thank you, God, for giving me the strength to endure. Chinita placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glassy. I was once chasing the wrong woman, he said, breaking the silence. But it led me to the right one. Adora looked at him, not with fear, not with resistance, but with something new. Trust. I'm not perfect, she said. I carry scars. Chinita smiled. And I've always preferred a woman who's been through fire. Because only she understands what it means to be forged. Their fingers touched gently. No promises. No pressure. Just peace. And somewhere in the sky, Santo smiled, unaware that the love story that built his future was only just beginning. The weeks following Santo's international trip unfolded like a quiet dream. Photos of him in Dubai circulated among school groups and local news pages. He stood proudly with other gifted children from across Africa, explaining scientific concepts with passion far beyond his years. In interviews, when asked about his inspiration, he smiled and said, "My mom. She taught me everything is possible, even when everything is against you." Adora watched these clips at home with tears streaming down her face. This was the same boy she once rocked to sleep on a leaking mattress, the child she fed with soap Gary under candlelight, because there was no electricity. Now he stood on global platforms, not just as a symbol of excellence, but as a living testament to her resilience. When he called from Dubai, he said, "Mummy, I miss you, but I promise to make you even prouder." Adora laughed, though her heart could barely contain the emotion. "You already have, my son. More than you'll ever know." Chinidu had taken time off work during the trip, choosing instead to stay close to Adora. Not to fill a role or earn a title, but simply to be there. They shared long walks in the evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes in deep conversation. She told him things she had never shared before, about the night she nearly miscarried Santo in the rain, about how she once thought of abandoning the baby out of fear, and how every day had been a battlefield. Chinita never interrupted. He just listened, his silence saying more than 1,000 words. And for the first time since her life fell apart, Adora began to smile without guilt. She started accepting the joy in her life without waiting for something to go wrong. She let herself feel not just relief, but happiness. Her laughter became more frequent, her movements less stiff, and her eyes began to hold light again. She had survived. Now she was beginning to live. But even in this peace, Ibuka's name lingered like a scar. Adora hadn't seen him again since their final conversation. She occasionally heard about him from market women, how he still ran a small POS stall near the junction, how he now wore oversized second-hand clothes and barely spoke to anyone. He had stopped drinking. He had started attending a small church where he swept the floors and sat in the back row. Some called it redemption. Adora called it consequence. She bore him no more hatred, just indifference. She had tried forgiveness once, and he burned her with it. Now, she only hoped he found his peace somewhere far from her world. Santo never asked about him again. He was content with the love he had, the mother who never gave up, and the man who never walked away. And in that quiet bond, something stronger than blood was born, a family shaped not by DNA, but by sacrifice and loyalty. The morning was calm. Birds chirped outside, and soft rays of sun filtered through the curtains. Adora stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress. Today was a small celebration, nothing flashy, just a gathering to welcome Santo back, and to thank the few people who supported her journey. Chinita stepped out from the bedroom in a crisp white shirt, fixing his cuffs. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Adora smiled, her hands still trembling. She wasn't used to compliments. Not the real ones. Santo returned that morning with gifts from Dubai, and a wider smile than ever before. He hugged his mother tightly, refusing to let go for several seconds. "You're my hero," he whispered. The three of them rode together in the limousine, not as broken souls pretending to be whole, but as a family that had earned their peace. As they approached the community center where the small gathering was to be held, people gathered along the road clapping, some singing. Neighbors who once whispered behind Adora's back now hailed her with pride. She waved shyly, overwhelmed by how far she had come. At the very corner of the street, beside the kiosk that once sold biscuits and sachet water, stood a man in a faded t-shirt and slippers. Ibuka. He watched the limousine crawl past slowly, his breath catching in his throat as the tinted windows rolled down. For a brief moment, his eyes met Adora's. She didn't scowl. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, not out of mockery, but closure. Santo looked out next, confused. "Who's that?" he asked. Chinita leaned in and gently said, "Someone who had his chance and lost it." And that was enough. The car rolled on, leaving Ibuka behind in silence. He sat back on the dusty bench, watching the only woman he ever truly loved drive past him, not just with a better man, but with the son he would never father again. He wiped his eyes slowly and whispered to himself, "God, give me peace." Then, for the first time in years, he stood up, turned away, and walked back into the shadows of his small, forgotten life. Inside the community center, the celebration was simple. Children danced, elders blessed the family, and Adora gave a short, powerful speech. "There were days I begged for bread," she said. "Days I slept on benches and washed clothes with tears in my eyes. But today I stand not because I am strong, but because I refused to give up." The hall erupted in applause. Chinito looked at her, his eyes filled with pride and affection. Samto held her hand, never letting go. That night, as they returned home, Adora stood at her window once again, but this time, she wasn't watching life pass by. She was living it. She turned to Chinito and whispered, "Thank you for choosing us." He smiled and replied, "No, thank you for surviving, so we could find each other." They sat in silence, arms around each other, as Samto curled up beside them. The story had started with shame, but it ended in love. And as the moon bathed their home in soft light, Adora finally slept, not with fear in her chest, but with peace in her heart. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.